Welcome back, everyone. This is the last panel of today, or the last lecture of today. I'm very delighted to introduce to you Hussein Aboubakr Mansour. He's an Egyptian-American intellectual and fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Security and Foreign Affairs. He's an author with a career focused on Arab political thought, Arab intellectual history, and the globalization of revolutionary radicalism. He has made contributions to understanding the intellectual and political dynamics within the Arab world and their intersections with global issues and the Western left. Previously, he served as an assistant professor for Hebrew language and culture at the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, California, and his writings have appeared in Commentary Magazine, Tablet Magazine, Mosaic, and other publications. So one of the few Egyptian-born Hebrew professors in the United States, right? And just to add on a more personal note, talking to Hussein always is a bit like experiencing kind of a tornado inside one's own head, because every minute there's a new idea you would need 15 hours to talk about, which is absolutely great. And I hope that you'll be able to catch a glimpse of this during his lecture, which starts now.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much for such a wonderful introduction, and thank you, everybody. I know that it's been a long day. You're probably very tired by now. Looking forward to get home. I'm the last thing between you and the end of the day, so I'll try to make it brief, and because I've been living in the United States for a very long time, I'll try to make it fun. Because in America, everything has to be fun, otherwise it's meaningless. So I did something that might be offensive to German sensibilities. I actually added memes in the presentation, which goes against this amazing introduction that Tom just gave me. But hopefully we will enjoy this, and also you will come out of here with some important insight about one of the most important topics in the modern world, in the contemporary area, actually in our current moment, and probably one of the largest elephants in the room globally since 1945, since the end of World War II. Antisemitism has been a major issue in the Middle East that, for various complexities, and maybe that will emerge also from the presentation, has been a very difficult topic to discuss, whether in the Middle East itself, or of course in Western academic or policy circles. So I'll try to give a very general introduction for the issue of anti-Semitism in the Arab world, of modern Arab societies. This general introduction will go more for breadth than from concentration and intensity, so I'll try to give a really wide overview of, I think, some of the most important things about the phenomena that we have to know. And hopefully I will leave you a lot with questions and more ideas to explore even on your own if you're interested in this. So I'm going to start. All right. I'm going to actually going to start. Nothing happened. Oh, here. Right. So I'm going to start actually from when the idea or the concept of anti-Semitism itself, not anti-Semitic thought or anti-Semitic imagery, but just the knowledge of anti-Semitism as a social phenomena. When did it first appear in the Middle East? When did Arabs know or start talking about anti-Semitism? I think that's actually a very important question, and the answer is even surprising. Those here who are familiar with Arab intellectual history may be familiar with the name of Rashid Rida. Rashid Rida is one of the most important figures in modern Arab intellectual history. He is one of the earliest modernizers of Arab thought. He was a traditional Syrian scholar that in the late 19th century engaged in an endeavor of intellectual renewal, intellectual revival. He started journals, he started critical publications that tried to modernize the Arab language, tried to modernize the Arab thought. In this regard, he was, we can say that he was a third generation modern Arab intellectual. There are two generations before him. The first one roughly within the first quarter of the 19th century, that basically much more associated with the Napoleonic campaign in Egypt. They were affected very much by that experience, and they are the ones who started really intellectual modernization. You have a second generation in the mid-century, and then you have the late 19th century which really laid a lot of the foundations of our thought, of modern Arab thought today. I mean, the modern standard Arabic, or the Fusha, was actually created by the generation of Rashid Rida. So Rashid Rida, as I said, he's a very important figure, and also a very important figure in the history of Islamist thought specifically, and very important things like the ideologies of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, this is a much more complex issue, because there supposedly at one point later in Rashid Rida, he will make a pivot from this open modernizing into actually a more conservative defensive posture that will almost turn against, or at least that's how scholars view it. But anyways, that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about something that he actually wrote in the year 1898. In 1898, he started a very important publication. It's called Al-Manar. They are the ones you see kind of the heading of it there, which is also a historically important publication. Manar means lighthouse, in which he really put a lot of his intellectual effort in this modernization. It was Cairo-based. In the first issue that he published, he said that the aim of the publication is going to be a religious social reform of our Muslim nation and all those who live in our midst, sharing our interests, and to demonstrate the agreement between Islam and reason. This is the opening of the inaugural issue of Al-Manar, stating the aim of the publication. He went further. Our primary purpose is to advocate for the education of boys and girls, not to criticize rulers, and to promote the sciences and the arts. This is kind of the mission statement that was the very first issue. So hopefully that gives you an idea about this endeavor, about what was happening culturally at that point. Then in the second issue, was published actually in February 1898. Actually, Rashid Rida wrote a very important articles about Jews in France. What was happening in 1898 in France? The Dreyfus affair. So actually, Rashid Rida wrote an article informing his readers about what was going on in France. And this is actually an important passage from that article. So I'm gonna read it. We received news of the domestic issues in France, particularly the Dreyfus and Zola affairs and the persecution, mistreatment, and discrimination faced by Jews. Readers should not assume that this stems from religious fanaticisms of the French nation, for it, France, is closer to irreligion than religious fundamentalism. Right, of course. This virulent intolerance is rooted in racial bias and envious disdain, propagated by journalists who hold animosity towards Jews and covet their wealth. It is perplexing to witness the infection of the Egyptian press with this ailment afflicting the French press. They belittle Jews, accuse them of achieving success through lucrative ventures and business acumen. True civility and justice compel us to embrace absolute freedom in public discourse. Productive work and legitimate money-making are social virtues. Some of their prominent French philosophers labored this hatred as a disease and hoped that progress in civilization and universal ethics would eradicate it. This is a fascinating passage. At the dawn of Arab intellectual modernity, from one of the most important key figures in the history of modern Arab intellectual life, including the Muslim Brotherhood. The founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hussein al-Banna, was actually a direct pupil of Rashid Rida. And he will take over Al-Manar. So Al-Manar actually will become basically the main publication of Islamic revival of the Muslim Brotherhood in the generation immediately following Rida. Rida goes on. If such vile incidents occurred amongst us, the Orientals, those French newspapers would have unleashed vitriol upon us and derided the Orientals with acerbic language and pens sharp as arrows. Were these newspapers in a weakened position akin to that of the Jews, they would have clamored for liberty and complete justice. You have here probably, what I believe, at least what I could find, is actually the earliest Arabic discussion of the modern phenomenon of anti-Semitism. Of course, it's not named. The name anti-Semitism does not appear there. But you see here he's describing a state of envy against Jews, discrimination against Jews, agitation by writers and journalists and pamphleteers, and something that he describes as a disease, an ailment, that hopefully it will be healed one day. So this is a very early conception of anti-Semitism, almost in modern terms, as some sort of a social ailment, over a century ago. Well, what is the situation today? All right, I'm gonna jump back and forth. I'm gonna jump to modern Arab culture today, as I grew up in it. I grew up in Egypt, and as it's actually present today in many countries of the Middle East. There is a prevalence of unbelievable levels of anti-Semitism in media, in art, in literature, in popular culture, everywhere. These are. I have to warn you. There is of course, I grew up in Egypt. There is somewhat of an Egyptian bias, of course, a lot of content I select, but a lot of the cases a lot of my discussion is most definitely not exclusive to Egypt. The picture of the middle, as you can see, is a popular Hitler impersonator in Alexandria, Egypt. He goes out and hangs out. This picture is from a couple of years ago. You have a cartoon in which you have a demon figure kind of hiding behind a fake, crying victim image by the United States, and then you have some poster also in some clothed store glorifying Hitler, things of that sort. So this is basically over 100 years after Rashid Rida talked about this disease that's called anti-Semitism that's unfortunate in France. If you open I'm going to start actually with some visual representations, because I believe visual representations will save actually a lot of time. A lot of the Arab media today, it's very common, especially in the times after October 7th, to find extremely anti-Semitic cartoons. This one from Bahrain from November last year. As you can see here, supposedly there's this demonic Jewish figure wearing the fake mask of humanity. The implications are clear. Another example, here you see Al-Watan from Oman from 2023. You see here this Israeli-American or Jewish-American alliance that's committing genocide, killing, murdering people, rivers of blood in Gaza. But there is major difference between the Star of David character and the American character. America is crying. The American is actually unhappy with what they are doing, but the other character is actually smiling. So you see that further dehumanization, the idea that even those allies that are helping those Zionist criminals commit their crimes, they are somehow coerced into it. They are really, the humanity inside them is yearning for justice. But of course, there's no humanity inside the other person. You have, this is from Saudi Arabia, Arab News, 2023. You have 3 characters, UN, EU, the United States. Supposedly they are imprisoned by Israel, also anti-Semitic motives. This is from Egypt, Al-Masri Yom. You have basically what's supposed to be a Jewish family represented in classical, of course, anti-Semitic European practices. You can tell by the nose, so on. Eating a child, drinking a blood. All of this is kind of classical. You have, of course, another lot of examples. We're going to go through this very quickly. So this is actually a tradition in the Arab press. Those who are familiar with the Arab press, this is not new. I mean, all the examples are new I got from after October 7th, but these are actually much, much older. This is just, I have volumes of these at home. It's kind of became a bad hobby of me collecting just Arab anti-Semitic cartoons. Some of them, as you can see, from the 60s and the 50s. Some of those from, many of those are from a very different time. So this is an established tradition, just in case you think that this is an October 7th specific. So I'm going to discuss now I'm going to talk about the types of a very introductory typology of Arab anti-Semitism, the way I've been trying to understand it. You have anti-Semitism in popular culture, anti-Semitism in higher culture, and I'm going to talk about each of those. And you have something, I couldn't find a good way to describe it, immediately political anti-Semitism. And what do I mean by that? What do I mean by immediately political anti-Semitism? I mean anti-Semitism that is deployed in a specific political context, in Arab politics, whether internally, whether regionally, whether domestically, in order to achieve a purpose that is kind of that's immediate to a political phenomenon. So something the state does because they are embarking on a project, something an opposition does because there is something political happening in the country, non-state actor. So it's not a perfect term, but this is the this way I think I can describe it. Popular anti-Semitism, a lot of people are familiar with it. Actually, what we saw in terms of cartoons could be a nexus between the popular and the high culture, since those are journalistic, but also it's a form of popular anti-Semitism. Popular anti-Semitism, I'm talking about anti-Semitism that is produced for mass consumption, of course, not high culture. You have comic books. These were my favorite when I was a child. It's kind of a knockoff James Bond with this Egyptian superhero who goes around the world and foils Jewish conspiracies. The figure, the blonde lady in the foreground, that's his Jewish nemesis. Her name was Sonia the Jewess. And that's kind of... and there's a lot of... there are a lot of things you can see here. It's not just the contrast of an Arab or a Jew. There's also the masculine versus the feminine. There's a lot, of course, going on here. You have the one next to it from Teil, Ferris Bilagawa. That was a major TV show that was aired actually in 2005 in Ramadan. People were watching it. It was a sensation in the country. Those who actually did some research must know about this because this made huge waves globally. The United States government got involved with the Egyptian government. This entire show, you had a huge budget, was entirely based on the protocols of Zion. So basically, it's supposed as a historical fact, supposedly. So a Jewish conspiracy of global domination. The U.S. government. There is a very contentious political context here. I'm talking about 2005. If you remember, a lot was going on. The Freedom Agenda, war in Iraq, American pressure, the neocons. So the Egyptian government played a game with the U.S. government. At the time, the U.S. government tried to push for them to stop the show. The Egyptian government made it a cause of freedom internally, that they are defying this American giant. So there's much more complex behind this. But anyways, this is an example of popular cultural anti-Semitism. The one with the menorah scene, that's a Syrian show, also very famous. It's called The Diaspora. It actually featured, you probably can find it on YouTube with English subtitle. It featured an actual scene of the blood libel. So a group of Jewish-looking, cartoonishly Jewish-looking characters abduct a Christian child, a child of their neighbor. And they go and they take their blood for the Passover. And of course, the political cartoon. So this is a lot of this is autonomous generation. That is, the society actually now generates this. A lot of this is not the many Arab governments. I would say Arab governments, a lot of them are helpless. This may have started in the 1950s with official action propaganda, let's say from the Ba'athist regime, from the Nasserist regime in Egypt. But now it's at the level of autonomous production. That is, even states, Arab states, many times cannot stop this. Part of this, for example, the famous phenomenon, for those who are familiar with it, that the availability of many translations of Mein Kampf and the Protocols of Zion with newspaper sellers. Now, if you think about it, a newspaper seller in the street, that's not for serious reader. They carry the most commercially viable. It's somebody mobile. You don't have a lot of space. You're just selling some newspapers in some street corner. Think about the economic choices that you have to make and what product are you going to put there to sell. You're going to put something that's cheap, that sells quickly. So it's wide availability tells you about, first of all, the kind of copies, the qualities, all cheap qualities. It's kind of easy buck that you can make in many Arab countries. That's kind of now, that's not high culture. I don't consider translated copies of Mein Kampf and Protocols high culture. I consider that popular anti-Semitism. But now I'm going to go actually to probably my favorite kind, not favorite in terms, but that's actually what I like to talk about the most, is anti-Semitism in high culture, in Arab high culture, in literature. And I'm going to give examples of some of them. This is, of course, a huge topic that hasn't been explored. First of all, because there is not a lot of, I think, serious research into Arab high culture in general. And because also even when there is research, they almost tend to completely avoid the issue of anti-Semitism. So I'm going to give examples of what I mean on this. And I believe that this is actually the most important manifestation of anti-Semitism in Arab societies and Arab culture. Literature, historiography, religion, philosophy, political science, social theory, and the humanities. I'm going to give example from and the arts, but I'm going to give a few examples of each. I'm going to start actually with literature. With literature, I'm going to talk about just one example from a novel that was published in 2005 by Khairi Shalabi. Khairi Shalabi, I believe, is actually the last greatest Arab novelist. So Arab literature, since modernization, so during the time of Rashid Rida, we're talking about the thors of modernization of the Arabic language, Arabic letters, so on and so forth. This process of modernization is going to actually reach its peak in the 40s, 50s, with the rise of the most important literary Arabic name in modern literature. Anybody familiar? Anybody can take a guess? Okay, Naguib Mahfouz. Naguib Mahfouz was the absolute peak of specifically Egyptian, which was the most culturally modern in terms of industry and production Arab society. Naguib Mahfouz was the peak. And then you have a generation of really good novelists. Khairi Shalabi, I think he passed away a few years ago. Khairi Shalabi, I think he was the last greatest Arab novelist. This is an example from a really good novel, actually, that he published in 2005. It's called The Poppy Flower. In The Poppy Flower, one of the main characters was actually a Jewish character. He was the best friend of the protagonist. The protagonist was this lost Egyptian who's trying to figure out his way in life. There's a lot of questions on identity. It's kind of post-colonial time. And then his best friend is this man. He's a family member whose mother is Jewish, but his father is Muslim. So his name is Hamada. Hamada is a variation of Muhammad in Egypt. And his family is very wealthy, but he really doesn't have anything. And in one of the dialogues, why he's telling him, for instance, why is he not wealthy? Theoretically, I'm the richest man in Egypt. Are you shocked to hear so? It's because of my mother. Of course, she's the Jewish woman. She's an oppressive tyrant. She doesn't give me money, but she has reservation about spending it all on Jewish organizations of Jews in Yemen and Iran and Palestine and Egypt. So he's poor. He hates his mother. His mother is this Jew who really doesn't help. He's an unhelpful character and a lot of things. But then Hamada's character itself is a weird character. The protagonist can't figure him out. As a matter of fact, at one point, the protagonist will discover that Hamada has an incestuous relationship with his own mother. So his mother is also his lover. And Hamada, he has a Muslim name. But one day, the protagonist will discover this pamphlet that Hamada was writing, actually, secretly, that will say the following: my Jewish brother, who is oppressed all over the world because of your God's dictated supremacy over all humanity, if you are truly the son of the chosen people, do not let Arabs defeat your Jewish king. So Hamada, who's supposedly a Muslim, is really Jewish. So he's Jewish, he's Muslim, he's a son, he's a lover, he's poor, he's rich. It's a character of inherent ambiguity. That is, the Jew here, just Hamada, actually kind of represents the anti-real, that makes the real always elusive. A reified, fetishistic expression of an infinite, all-consuming, dynamic, progressing ambiguity that consumes everything. It's a mysterious agent of disintegration. With Hamada, no borders are clear. No boundaries are apparent. It's an extremely elusive character. A friend, an enemy, you don't know what he is. And through him, every interaction between him and the protagonist gets completely disoriented. You're threatened by complete loss. He's actually reminiscent, I think, for example, of the spirit of perpetual negation. That was Goethe's Mephistopheles. This is a passage from Goethe. I am the spirit of perpetual negation, and rightfully so. For all things that exist deserve to perish, and would not be missed. Much better it would be if nothing were brought into being. Thus, what you men call destruction, sin, evil, in short, is all my sphere, the element I most prefer. I found these lines actually express the character of Hamada the Jew in Khair Shelby's novel pretty well. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but of course I have to cover a lot of material. These lines specifically actually are very important in the literary history of modernity. There is a very important Marxist interpretation that celebrates the destruction, and then there is a lamentation, the kind of Volkish lamentation over the destruction. But all of this, you find it packed into the character of Hamada the Jew. So that was an example from literature. It was just, as I said, I'm giving quick examples because I want to cover a topic that I think a lot of people don't have a lot about. In the humanities, that's actually, I got my degree in Egypt, in Rufai University, university close to Cairo University, actually Hebrew and Jewish studies. So I actually studied with a lot of these books and a lot of these people. The study of Hebrew was professionalized specifically as enemy studies with the emergence of the Arab-Israeli conflict. The most two important figures in the history of the study of Hebrew and Judaism in the humanities in Egypt are two men by the name of Hassan Zaza and Sayyid Muhammad Ashur. These are two examples of also the writing. So both of them worked together on that first book in the white cover, Al-Yahud Laysu Tugaran Bil-Nash'at. It's actually a very interesting book. It's got, Jews are not inherently commercial. So basically, it's you understand the idea of Jews and capitalism, the tie between Jews and kind of the commercial class that brought money economy into capitalism. So they wrote a book actually denying that. This was within, they wrote it, I believe, in 1979. So this was the time that Egypt was making transition from socialism to more capitalist open economy. And they wrote this book to say that actually Jews have nothing to do with commerce, and Jews have always been parasitic economic agents. The Jew is never a true merchant, because now being merchant is a noble, supposedly is a noble profession, but a parasitic economic nation. Now, there's another book that was written also by them about racism, and that book is going to try to discuss the issue of racism specifically, and in it they will try to make Judaism the actual origin of all racism in the world, and also make it a fact that the Jews actually never the victim of racism. So for example, they will write that Jews are hated not because they are Semites, because Arabs themselves they adopted in the Middle East it's accepted that Arabs are Semites. The racial perspective is internalized. So Jews are hated not because they were Semites, but because they were Jews. We have to make a difference. Nobody hates Semites. Jews are hated because of who they are. The religion of Judaism, and this is going to be also a recurring theme, is the core of Jewish racism. Behind the facade of humanism, there is a racist barrier to reciprocity and tolerance. And the true content of Zionism, and this is very interesting because this is the opposite of the claim that a lot of people try to make today, that Zionism is bad exactly because it's Judaism. That what makes Zionism evil, this is a modernist, we're talking about texts really from the modernist era, in which modernist, secularist, atheist ideologies were considered the key to modernization in Arab societies. So basically the authors, and it was not just them, this is also a sample, were saying, no, don't think that Zionism is like what we're trying to do, this secular, nationalist, socialist program of progress. No. It's Judaism. It's evil because it's just a modernization of that ancient evil of Judaism. That's kind of what they all say. You have also a lot of philosophical contributions. Antisemitism and humanism. Antisemitism as a form of humanism, of course, has been like that in Europe for a very long time. The idea of Jews as the enemies of the human race. This is actually the title of this very book by the very famous Egyptian feminist author, one of the vanguards of Egyptian and Arab feminism, Aisha Abdurrahman, actually A'da al-Bashar, the enemies of humanity. And the entire book, of course, is about the Jews. So the idea that Judaism is the enemy of humanism has been a staple specifically in German intellectual history for a very long time. You already find intimation of it in the anthropological writings of Kant. You find some good, very sophisticated foundations of it, of these theological writings of Hegel. It really, I think, will receive its most concise formulation in the writings of Ludwig Feuerbach, and from Feuerbach you will get it into whether Marxist theory, of course after it gets flipped on its feet, and a materialist version of it, or in actually other anti-Semitic. Wilhelm Marr, people forget that Wilhelm Marr, the patriarch of anti-Semitism in Germany, he was actually a student of Feuerbach. He actually edited books of Feuerbach. So the idea that anti-Semitism is a form of humanism, it might sound counterintuitive. It's not really counterintuitive. It actually makes perfect sense in certain philosophical contexts. So you have a writing about the enemies of humanity, human race. She wrote that book, for instance, in 1967, in which she called the writers and the intellectuals take their place in battle against humanity. And the book offered this philosophy of history, this big narrative that was really divided into three sections. The battle in the ancient Near East, so basically retelling the history of Judaism as an assault on humanity in its origins and its rising. And then in Arabia, so the second assault on humanity in their story with Prophet Muhammad. And then in Europe. So what happened in World War II, that was the third wave of Jewish assault on humanity. And of course, there is at the end, there is now the battle again is back here. So you have that perspective. Also is very common in historiography. This is a much bigger topic. I didn't get a lot of, I didn't give examples. But basically, almost all the historiography, of course, is a modern tradition. That is historiography is very different than pre-modern historiography, Islamic historiography, so on and so forth. So we're talking about the modern ways in which Arab societies learn to write history. Where do you think they learned that from? All the methodologies, all the different schools. Of course, European influence. All the ways that established to do historiography in Arab societies almost have a focus in making sure that, first of all, Jews are completely excluded from the history of the region. So basically excluded, for example, from, especially with the complete internalization of the Semite racial perspective, that Arabs are Semites. So actually there are various ways in which this is done to exclude Jews from being Semites, whether through telling stories about the Khazars, for instance, the idea that Jews are the Khazar, really modern Jews are really coming from the Khazars. The real Jews are really Muslim now. They are the Palestinians. They are Muslim and Christian and so on. Excluding them from national histories, and I think that's even much more complex and much worse, because that's actually much more important in Arab public discourse. Not a lot of educated Arabs, I mean middle class, literate people. Not a lot of literate people will be interested in ancient history, but a lot of literate people will have to, at least for school, will have to read modern history. Modern history of Syria, if you're Syrian, the modern history of Egypt, if you're Egyptian, the modern history of Morocco. The exclusion, the complete exclusion and suppression from the Jewish presence in modern times, and I'm sure that you know how big some of these communities were, is a glaring omission from a lot of the modern historiography of modern Arab societies. If it's said at all that Jews used to live here till recently, it will be said in the context of a Zionist conspiracy. That is, they lived here, but they were so disloyal that once Zionism came along, they left. So things will be discussed that way. Or there are more benign historiographic accounts that are being actually done recently in order to absolve these Jews from being traitors, saying we wronged them, we expelled them. But it was because of Zionism. Zionism exploited us, kind of made a conspiracy, bombings in Iraq, bombings in Egypt, and they are the ones who caused this. So there are now some attempts to create new accounts that remedy some of this, but they still rely, that the constant here is the exclusion of at least Zionism, Israel, and full guilt, and the issue of anti-Semitism itself from the historiographic account. Now philosophy, that's a big issue, also often not seen. This is Abdurrahman Badawi. Abdurrahman Badawi, for those who do not know him, he's probably the most important philosophic figure. He's the first Arab who has actually a PhD in modern philosophy from an Arab university, from Fuad al-Awwal University, which is Cairo University now. He actually got a PhD in 1941, and he was a student of Heidegger. So he lived in Germany in the 1930s, and his PhD was basically a synthesis between Heidegger's philosophy and Sufism. While he was in Germany, It was huge influential, and it had a huge influence in determining the direction of modern metaphysics, or at least the ways that those who are interested in philosophy in the Middle East think about metaphysics. He was also a huge apologetic of the Nazi regime. In 1933, he attended, I believe it was in Munich, the what was it? The decadent art. Yeah, he was there. He was very close. Apparently he was in a place close to the Führer, and the Führer had a huge magnetism on him, and he became a lifelong, ardent, a philosophical fan of Germany in general, of the Third Reich specifically. Now, he's a hugely influential figure. The Syrian intellectual George Tarabishi, very important intellectual, passed away not too long ago. He wrote about Rahman Badawi. He said he is the teacher of all modern philosophical thinking of the Egyptian, of the Arab, modern Arab intellectual tradition. Now, there's a lot of contribution of Badawi. He's actually one of the first people to try to translate Mein Kampf. There are a lot of things, but I'm just, again, giving just it's a very extensive subject. So Badawi also had huge contributions in this. Also, there's another very important figure, very much less well known, because actually his importance, I think, he's going to become an important figure later, because he's very important for the United States specifically. His ideas are at the foundation of actually American Islamism. Now, that's a bigger subject, but the modern Islamist movements in the United States, a lot of them are actually founded on the ideas of Ismail Rajil Farouq. Ismail Rajil Farouq also had a PhD in German philosophy. He's originally a Palestinian, born in 1921. I think his PhD was in Nietzsche and Hegel. And he will write extensively about the issues of Zionism, about Israel. Those are two of his books about the issue. One in Arabic, The Origins of Zionism in Judaism. So same idea, the idea that Zionism is really, the problem of Zionism, that it's Judaism, it's modern Judaism. That's what makes it so evil. And then he has this book, which you can find in English, Islam and the Problem in Israel, in which he makes this philosophical argument in a very Heideggerian existential language about the importance for the being of humanity to annihilate or negate the existence of Israel completely. His works are Hegelian in various ways. Here is a passage just to give you an idea of what I mean by Hegelians, even if it's superficially Hegelians. I think these influences also remain very important. The ancestors and the best people of the human race are he had an Arab nationalist faith, I forgot to mention. So he had an Arab nationalist faith, the way he started his life, very committed to secular atheistic Arab nationalism till the 1960s. And by the 1960s, he dropped that and he became an Islamic thinker. He taught at McGill University, he taught at UPenn. And as I said, he became a founder of a certain modern Islamist philosophy that actually picked up and at the foundation of a lot of the Islamist movement in the United States. As the ancestors of the best people of the human race, the Arabs were the bearers and the carriers of the divine message, different moments of consciousness. Hegelian language. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. At first, the Arab spirit revolted against the exclusiveness. This is almost to the letter early Hegel. Exclusiveness and separatism of the Jews. It then achieved universalism, ethical idea in Christianity. But alas, Christianity failed in its mission, especially in the hands of the West, until the Arab spirit became ready to face the divinity once more. So on and so forth. The emergence of Islam thus constitutes the highest moment of Arab consciousness. This was still a pantheistic, Hegelian, almost atheistic stuff. He's going to move from that. The Arab will disappear at all later on, and it's going to be more Islamic. But the structure of thought, the epistemology, is identical. It hasn't changed. So you'll find that in Islam and Israel, for example, if you read it. And then my personal favorite, Abdul Wahhab al-Misiri. Abdul Wahhab al-Misiri, he's probably the most important, most sophisticated social theorist, Arab social theorist in the last century. The fact that not much is written about him in English, I don't know, in German, it says a lot about the state of scholarship and the state of research.
It's because he's so hard to read.
He's so hard to read, there's a reason it's so hard to read. Abdul Wahhab al-Misiri is so hard to read because he basically is the Arabizer of critical theory. He had to coin it. think about this. To articulate critical theory in any language, what do you need? You need an extremely sophisticated, technical, critical language. Did you think that existed in Arabic in the mid-century? It did not. Abdul Wahhab al-Masiri had to make it from scratch and invent an entire critical lexicon in order for him to be able to construct, let's call it critical Jewish theory. And he will actually systematize that theory. It will be directed specifically against Judaism and Zionism. And he will systematize it. He will make it into this complete, all-inclusive system that will be published in actually 7 volumes. It's something enormous. You have to see it. Actually, this is the cover. You can see from the picture of the cover kind of the book. He was a student at Columbia University in the 1960s. I think he was a student of Herbert Marcuse. I got a lot of what he did. I'm going to talk a little bit about him because, as I said, he's my personal favorite. He's my personal favorite because actually I grew up reading his books. Now, don't ask me why somebody, a teenager, reading critical theory. Just found my way to it when I was in Egypt. He was born in 1938. Played a little bit with Islamic movement, Muslim Brotherhood when he was little, but then moved on right to the Egyptian communist movement. He was a communist for a while. Came to the United States to make his PhD in Columbia. Same time as Edward Said, kind of that same generation. Studied with Herbert Marcuse. Of course, by the time he's back, we're talking about the late 60s, the rise of the New Left, the collapse of the total big ideologies, Stalinism, the collapse of faith, kind of that was really the beginning of postmodernism and post-structuralism, intellectually and politically, and he was part of that wave. And the collapse of Arab nationalism was not just, it's always in historiographic tradition or in history, telling history of the region, which I disagree with a lot of it. The collapse of Arab nationalism was a direct result of the defeat of the 6-Day War. That's usually kind of the narrative. I don't think that's a complete narrative. There was really a global development of the collapse of a lot of these pan and total ideologies. And I don't see why Arab nationalism would have been any exception, especially how attuned Arab intellectuals were to Western intellectual life. So basically, he came back to Egypt during that moment, and he started trying to reincorporate Islam in the way of thinking. Ultimately, he will become one of the most important Islamic thinkers. He was constantly hosted on Al Jazeera, and he's beloved by the Muslim Brotherhood. And then he will start trying to articulate a reading of critical theory that's primarily anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist, that ultimately he's going to work on it for 20 years, will be published, those 7 volumes will be published in 1999. And just to give you a sense of his achievement, really, it starts, the name of the encyclopedia, it's called the Encyclopedia of Jews, Judaism, and Zionism. And it goes through critical analysis of the history, the earliest history of Judaism, and the Hebrew prophetic tradition, through almost all Jewish history, including medieval Jewish history in Europe or the Middle East, up until the modern days, up until Masiri's days, pretty much, with Israel and Zionism, and so on. In order to do that, Masiri, he was a very intelligent guy. He understood that critical theory rests on a certain German philosophical tradition. You cannot just articulate critical theory from the middle of the page if you really want it to become what his vision was, that this is to become the foundation of a new Arab and Muslim culture, a new Arab Muslim social culture, consciousness, and a new Arab Muslim political consciousness. In order for this to happen, he understood that what he needs to translate is not just a couple of works by Marcuse and Horkheimer or Adorno. He understood that he has to start from the roots, and this is why he had to go all the way back from Judaism. Because basically, his analysis, you get an early or a classical German philosophy analysis of Judaism. As I said, appeared in Kant, appeared in Hegel. Judaism as a spirit of separateness, or basically the emergence of Judaism as a spirit of separateness and exclusion in the world. Judaism itself, ultimately, and this is what it will become very clear in Feuerbach, as a myth of Jewish supremacy, right? Or the monotheistic God And I know that probably those who are trying to make sense of this, there are a lot of questions, Mark, how is this Islamic? But the monotheistic God as the myth of Jewish supremacy, the establishment of Jewish racial supremacy in the world. So he goes through all this, all of the philosophical reading of Judaism, Kant, Hegel, Feuerbach, and so on. And then he gets into modern social theory. He starts even from the 19th century. He doesn't just jump. You get a Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft. He translates all of the body of Tunis. Ferdinand, how do you say his name? Tunis. Huh? I don't. Okay, you know who I'm talking about. Ferdinand Tunis, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, or society and community, in which there is a Wissenwille and the Kurwille, or the rational will, or the intrinsic will, or the irrational will. And of course, Jews will always be that spirit of the irrational will, of the arbitrary will, of capitalism, so on and so forth, all the way through Karl Mannerheim's Sociology of Knowledge, Dialectic. He doesn't mention a lot of these publications, but kind of when you read, if you're familiar with the literature, you understand what's going on. Till he articulates, of course, basically a critical theory of modern Arab and Muslim society that ultimately makes Zionism the manifestation or the concrete embodiment of instrumental reason. Instrumental reason that turns men into one-dimensional men, that creates an authoritarian personality, so on and so forth. So basically, salvation from Zionism ultimately is the salvific end for Arab history. Extremely successful. I can't tell you that he is the most complex social theorist, as I said, in modern Arab culture. I mean, nobody reads Misseri. You know, elite Muslim Brotherhood youth, the smartest ones, get into Misseri. Another person, for example, Yusuf Hafiz. These, as I said, Misseri is extremely important in his own right. Yusuf Hafiz is important, but also, you know, using him as an example, because Yusuf Hafiz will exemplify, or I'm using his as a sample for another idea in a lot of Arab social theorists. The Yusuf Hafiz will try to actually build in. Edward Said actually talked about it as well, but Edward Said, I don't consider him as an Arab intellectual. The Yusuf Hafiz basically will talk about how Judaism, or Jews, modern Jews, had dual functions in the modern world, whether a function with capitalism, perpetuating systems of imperialism, oppression, and so on, but they have another function, which is a subversive function. Jews as the vanguard, or the reservoir of counterculture that makes them the vanguard of subversive, deconstructive consciousness against oppression. And then he would basically say, he read this after 1967, that now it's the turn of the Arabs. The Jews forfeited that task. They forfeited being the vanguard of emancipatory consciousness. But we now took their place, we as Arabs, because we are their victims. So now we're kind of the vanguards for humanity. This idea also will be available to a lot of social theorists. So these are examples from high culture anti-Semitism in Arab culture. As I said, these are just samples. You know, I have only 10 minutes left. That's why I have to be quick. Then there is, of course, the immediately political anti-Semitism. I'm talking about, as I said, anti-Semitism deployed strategically in immediate political context to achieve a goal. The Iranian anti-Semitism I believe, is an example of that. The Iranian regime is an imperialist, regional imperialist system of domination and power. Their use of anti-Semitism is just... okay, you forgot this. It's not just a matter of ideology. It's actually primarily is a matter of power. You have also the use by political oppositions. Remember, for example, in a country like Egypt, in difficult times, you can't protest against the government and say the government is illegitimate, but you can burn the flag of Israel, and you can talk about how evil the Jews are. And this will be political opposition, because the government will be seen as a friend of the Jews, a friend of Israel, so on and so forth, because of the Camp David Accords. So here you see it also as a vehicle of delivering political opposition. This happened during Mubarak time. I can actually tell a story really quickly. In the late 90s, 10 minutes. So Egypt is the largest population in the East Mediterranean, right? Everybody, I think a lot of people know that. Huge population. What is the daily? What is the largest market of daily transactions in any country? Grocery shopping. Grocery shopping is one of the largest shares in the market because everybody has to eat. Everybody has to eat. Everybody buys food pretty much every day. Till the end of the 90s, grocery shopping in Egypt. So basically, I want to say grocery shopping in Egypt is the largest grocery market in the entire Middle East because of just the size of the population. Until the late 90s, Egypt did not have the modern experience of grocery shopping. Grocery shopping was not modernized. You didn't have a supermarket like Aldi. You go with a cart and you have everything and you get what you want. You have just a kind of little mom and pop shops. You go to buy the vegetable store to buy vegetables. You go to the poultry to buy chicken. You go to the butcher to buy meat, which is much nicer. But anyways, it wasn't really the modern experience. Then you had the UK chain, Sainsbury, that basically thought, you know what? We should go to the Middle East, start with Egypt, the biggest market. Let's modernize the shopping experience. Let's get an early entrance advantage and be the first people to go into that market and modernize it and get a good amount of the market share. This happened, huge initial investment by Sainsbury. Can you imagine, in order to just start a whole grocery chain out of nothing? They did that in Egypt. The political opposition ran the rumors that Sainsbury was owned by Jews. In a matter of a year, I actually remember because I participated in the riots. I did actually, when I was 10 years old, I did throw stones at Sainsbury shops and they stole stuff from there. And this happened a lot that in 2 years, they pulled out. They just cut their losses. They lost all of the initial investment pretty much, and they had to leave. So here also you have some economic effects, but you see the work of the opposition. And here the opposition wanted to be protecting the small business owners and so on. So that's an example of immediately political anti-Semitism, what I'm talking about. You have the example of Muntasir al-Zayyat. In the 1990s, Egypt has had an Islamic insurgent since the assassination of Sadat until 1997. It's almost turned into a civil war against the emerging jihadist groups at the time. In the 90s, the government strikes a reconciliation deal with the Islamic movement in which some arrangement is made. They will stop fighting, they will stop killing people, they will stay in the mosques, kind of a deal in order to just hold down the tension. And in that deal, or in the statements that were made in the court, in order to seal that deal, that now the Islamic movements are going to stop fighting, and they will just try to fix society by just talking to people. A big part of the document was actually about Jews. That while we're killing each other as Egyptians, brother and brother, the Jews are conspiring against us. The enemies of Egypt are trying to destroy us. And this is why we need to stop fighting. What you have here, you have this immediately political anti-Semitism in a very immediate, very specific political context that wanted to give legitimacy to a reconciliation for the supporters of both groups. So why the Islamic movements, if we keep fighting, we're gonna be eaten alive altogether. We need to stop fighting the government, at the same time in the government. So these are the examples that I'm talking about. As I said, I came up with the immediately political anti-Semitism. I don't know, because it's distinct. I believe it's distinct. I just don't know how to describe it in a better way. So, wait a minute. What happened? We started. I said there will be some memes. We started in Rashid Rida talking about a disease, a social illness. And all of a sudden, all of this happened. How did we get there? How did this anti-Semitism happen? Well, there are multiple answers about what is going on in the Middle East, what is going on in Arab societies in terms of anti-Semitism. Each answer became it's a rationalization attempt that became institutionalized on its own right. That is, it became a big answer that has its scholars, its modes of literature, its own institution. The first answer is, of course, Islam. The problem, obviously, lays in the nature of the Islamic religion itself. The attempts of secularization from the beginning of Rashid Rida. So if you ask, okay, what about these writings of Rashid Rida? What about the period of secularization? Well, it was an ephemeral attempt to secularize that ultimately ended up with Islam reasserting itself, right? The Islamic resurgence. It didn't work. Muslim societies deeply are hostile to secularism, so on and so forth. So you had the resurgence of these things. These are some literary examples. Clash of Civilizations is probably the most famous kind of expression of that idea, whether in the essay of Bernard Lewis or later by Sam Huntington. The legacy of Islamic anti-Semitism is like this huge source book huge, I don't know if you guys anybody knows what I'm talking about, of basically documents from early Islamic history till now that basically shows hatred to the Jews. So it creates the image, you have a construction of the image of this continuous eternal Jew hatred from the earliest beginnings of Islam in the Quran. You have texts from the Quran, texts from Hadith, texts from medieval Islam, texts from medieval Islamic history. So it builds that Islam has this timeless problem of anti-Semitism. It's a very popular idea, I think, with a lot of people, especially in the post-9/11 atmosphere. It became very successful because also you have the Islamic context that's the immediate context that a lot of us and the generation before us, for the young people, experience that. It's just Muslim society, Islamic resurgence, Iran 1979. So there was something explanatory, seemed to conform to immediate perception with the idea that there is something seems to be problematic, specifically with Islam. For Arab intellectuals also, by the way, a lot of them agree with this. Is that surprising? That's actually because Arab intellectuals, mostly atheistic, they believe the problem is Islamic fundamentalism that destroyed their own secular project. So funny enough, despite that, this is now, especially in some left circles, would be non-PC, Islamophobic. It's actually a lot of Muslim and Arab intellectuals, secular intellectuals, would agree with this. I think this is the narrative that's very popular, especially now in the atmosphere after October 7th, especially with a lot of liberals in the United States. And I think liberals will always fall back on this. Because for a liberalism, for a lot of segments of liberalism is identical to rationalism, right? That's what liberalism means. And anything wrong must be attributed to some sort of irrationalism. And the main culprit of irrationalism for a lot of liberal thought is religion. So I think a lot of liberals, when they think about the issue of Muslim anti-Semitism and they see the evidence and you don't know how to explain, I think a lot of them may fall back to this theory. There is another theory, I just added it there, I don't think it's theory, but it's just one way that people explain anti-Semitism through anti-Semitism. So it becomes a self-assertion brute fact, like why are they doing this? Because they're anti-Semites. You know, it's just, this was Barry Weiss is an American journalist that became very famous, I think, for her book, How to Fight Against Anti-Semitism, became one of the foremost important liberal Jewish voices about the issue of Muslim anti-Semitism specifically. And I think in order to avoid this, because she has strong liberal credentials, she falls into the circular, just anti-Semitism because of this timeless essence of anti-Semitism. I think there's a problem also that this intersects with modern Jewish identity construction, that sadly a lot of it is built on anti-Semitism. That is, I believe that a lot of the modern Jewish identity is built as or the meta-narrative, the biblical meta-narrative of traditional Jewish historiography or rabbinical historiography has been replaced by a modernized historiography in which the primary struggle is not between the Jew and God, but between the Jew and the world. So anti-Semitism became itself the narrative of modern Jewish identity. So this narrative is also important for Jewish identity. You have anti-Judaism. This was an attempt by David Nirenberg. It's basically poor man's Edward Said. Type. So he took.
Absolutely correct.
He based this entirely on Orientalism, but it's a much lighter version of Orientalism, social construction. It has all the flaws of Said and none of his intellectual rigor, in my opinion. I'm going through a lot of this. And then, of course, you have the idea of the Nazi influence and Nazi propaganda. I think the people here might be familiar with it. Jeffrey Hertz's book, it's very famous for it, Nazi propaganda in the Middle East. That the Nazis, they did indeed have huge operation of propaganda in the Middle East that was huge, very influential. I did a lot of research on it, especially this guy, Yunus Bahari. He was the key figure in the Radio Zissen. It was Voice of Berlin in Arabic. Bombarded the Middle East, Arab societies during World War II with an insane amount of anti-Semitism in the European language. So you have this also as a possibility, as an explanation. Then, of course, you have more left-wing perspectives of, well, the problem is Zionism. Arab anti-Semitism is basically a culture, the ideology, a superstructural manifestation of the resistance to Zionist colonialism. So you do have a more leftist analysis that understands these cultural anti-Semitism as forms of, or the ideology, the populist ideology, misguided as it is, of resistance to Zionist oppression and dehumanization, specifically with the Palestinians. You have another wider version of that puts it in the context of imperialism, third world resistance to imperialism. And then, of course, you have complete denial, which is as also a river in Egypt. That's why I have this picture. I'm from Egypt. So denial, of course, is a way also. So you see a lot of people simply not dealing with the issue. And you find that a lot in the Middle East studies, scholarship. You find that a lot in Islamic studies, scholarship. People who just don't know how to deal with the issues because just all the perspectives seem to be politicized one way or the other. Or just you're not able to find an answer that's not going to really embroil you in ideological, very scarring ideological battle. So just a lot of people avoid it completely, understandably. So my own perspective, that now I told you how people think about this, whether people on the left, whether liberals, how do people, I'll tell you how I think about this. I actually think all of them are wrong. I think they're fake news. I think it should be clear by now that I do not think, from my discussion of these ideas, I don't think any of them actually are satisfactory. I think some of them might be satisfactory, some of them have some parts of truth, but I don't think any of them truly explain, none of them actually explains the problem of anti-Semitism in the Middle East. I think in order for us actually to understand, we have to go back to where we started. We have to back to the future, back to Reda, back to where we came from, in order to see how this might have happened. Let's go back to the very text that we started with. We highlighted illness, social illness in a society, but there are actually a lot of other things that are important. He was talking about that French nation is closer to irreligion than zealous fundamentalism. He talked about something called intolerance, something called racial bias. These are new concepts in Arabic as well. Envious disdain. He talked about journalists that seem to have wielded a lot of power in society. He talked about press. He talked about legitimate money making. And then he talks about three important things. He talks about freedom. He mentions freedoms. He mentions something called social virtue. And he mentions something called progress of civilization. What we see here, this text is a post-Enlightenment, post-Christian text. Freedom, the primary concept on which modern political philosophy is organized. Virtue, one of the primary concepts around which modern moral philosophy is organized. And progress. The key concept around which the most important, probably the most important politically relevant philosophical tradition, the philosophy of history, around which all of the Western philosophy of history is organized, which is really what replaced theology for a lot of people. So what we're talking here, we're talking about, but by the time that this text was published, we're talking about a thoroughly post-Enlightenment, post-Christian, and may I add post-Muslim Arab culture that was born. Our understanding of anti-Semitism must go back with these assumptions. We need to stop all of our essentialism, all of our post-colonial analysis, and we actually, I believe, that we need to restart over and look at Arab culture, like the rest of the third world, but specifically Arab culture for many reasons, as a direct extension. By the late 19th century, has already become an extension of post-Enlightenment, post-Christian, maybe now we can call it post-religious, post-Christian, post-Muslim intellectual life. The way that anti-Semitism developed there, if we can look at it in the way that intersects with the modernization of these societies, when we even get insights about European history itself that you can't get from European history, that is, we'll be able to see how anti-Semitism might be a necessary byproduct of a certain epistemology, a certain structure of thought about modern political subjectivity that basically is almost unavoidable if you think about reality in certain ways. But in order to know these things, we have, as I said, to go back and examine this. The last thing that good thing, I think we're doing good on time. The last thing.
No, but it's okay.
Okay, 2 minutes. 2 minutes.
We're almost
even
finished.
what I want to talk about is actually even the virtual culture that I talked about. Let's go back to the cartoons. You remember this? We watched these cartoons, right? What do you see here? So you see here a political cartoon. This is actually from way before October 7. So you see what's in the background blurry. A sense of the sacred, right? The mosque, the holy, the sacred. What is the sacred? The principle of legitimation, principle of justification. That what it bestows the moral justification on what you do. And then through the tool, the knife, through salvific violence, against the archetype of evil, this cosmic evil, the Jew down there, then you ascend to the sacred. So you have here a certain kind of political iconography of a certain aesthetic quality. I'm glad that we had this day about art because I was planning to talk about this. A certain aesthetic quality of the binary that we talked about between good and evil. Where is this, do you think, where did this come from? Where did it come from to Arab politics? Actually, we talked about this earlier today. It comes from the revolutionary tradition, almost identical aesthetics of the sacred in the background, whether you have the emerging African nations, that's the new sacred, the post-colonial. You have the Russian, what's the sacred in the background? The factories, the workers, the proletariat, the central mystery of communism, of course. And of course you have the Chinese, you have the people, kind of the Maoist propaganda. The same thing, you have the enemy below, you have the violence, and through the violence you ascend to the sacred. And ultimately, the source of this aesthetic itself comes from the atheization of what I don't know if that's a word. I just came up with it. The atheization of Christian iconography. And I'm sure you guys have familiar with this icon. Have you seen it before? St. George slaying the dragon. You have in the background the sacred, the church, right? The purity that needs protection. And through that sacred violence against the slithering serpent, you ascend to the sacred, to the uncommunity. So basically, I think actually Muslim societies are post-Christian societies. I think they are atheist Protestants. That's how I think about it. But anyways, I hope that I help. As I said, I'm going for width. It's just a very big topic. And I wanted to give you as many things to think about as possible, as to open different ways of thinking, different ways of seeing these things as possible. So thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions now.
Thank you for your great lecture. I'm going to make this very short. I have just a few points and kind of questions I wanted to mention. First, a comment. I think what you kind of not forgot to mention, but I think what's very important when you take Rashid Rida as an example of, can we just go back to Rida again? Here we have Rashid Rida as someone who questions European anti-Semitism. It's of course very important to mention that he became also a very aggressive anti-Semite later. So Rida himself represents the change of modern Arab culture that you're speaking of rightly, because once he gets accustomed to Zionism, and once he reads more European anti-Semitism, it merges into its head into an anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. That's one thing. Then what I wanted to say about David Nierenberg is that while I think your judgment was very hard, because I think that Nierenberg actually has some intellectual merit and is important as a theoretician of interaction of, especially of European Christians with Judaism, while his chapter about Islam and Judaism really is not that important. I had a similar thought as you, even though I did not have this brilliant idea to say it's the poor man's Edward Said, because I also had the feeling that Nierenberg was mostly just describing any kind of othering that happened to the Jews from the perspective of Muslims or Christians. And I thought othering, basically just describing that you have a different idea than the Jews have about God, is not a form of anti-Semitism. And Nierenberg's theory does not fully explain what's the difference between othering and enmity, in a way. That was my personal criticism of Nierenberg, which of course is a bit similar to how Said also makes a very sweeping claim about othering and enmity. Then I want to provoke. Another point I'm just going to leave out because we want questions. I'm going to provoke. So you mentioned Hassan Zaza as an Egyptian professor of Israel and of Jewish studies. Yeah. I read one of his books about the Jewish personality. The Israeli personality, الشخصية الإسرائيلية, and I also read a book by Qadri Hufni, very similar, also called the Israeli personality, and both of them basically say that the Jew, the Zionist Jew, the Israeli, is psychologically defunct, perverse, because of something that happened in Jewish history. It might be the claim to Jewish supremacy. As for both of them say there's kind of this divide between the Jewish claim to supremacy and the Jewish experience of oppression, like the Holocaust, which they do not deny. So they kind of psychologize the bad state, the bad civilizational state of the Jews. And this reminds me a bit of something that is also known from the other side, like Raphael Patai, Jewish anthropologist who wrote a book which explains that every bad thing that's happening in the Arab world, and especially their enmity to Israel, is basically kind of the effect of the psychological deformation and primitivity of all Arabs between Morocco and Iraq. And when we have this idea of Judaism as a great bringer of civilizational downfall, then we also have theorists. Also, I'm specifically mentioning Jewish authors here now. This is specific, like Batye or Andrew Boston, who are basically saying that Islam is basically the global force of civilizational downfall. So I want to make the thesis that there is the difference between, not the difference, but what is different between the Arab anti-Semitism and the Nazi anti-Semitism is that the Nazi anti-Semitism almost exclusively was a pathological response to certain social conditions or the outcome of philosophy, ideology in Europe, while in this case we actually do have a conflict, a political conflict between the Arab world and Israel, which means that you can actually have on both sides thinkers, philosophers who are pathologizing the other side as the embodiment of civilizational human psychological evil, which did not happen with the Shoah. Hardly, Jews didn't write books about how the Germans are the embodiment of evil after World War II. In this case, yeah, but it's very, very diminished. It's not an important strain of Jewish intellectual history, while Jewish anti-Islam writing is much more prominent, I think, which shows you that it would be interesting to comparatively look at it, even though I do not want to claim that it's on the same scale or on the same level of depravity sometimes, with Raphael Patai probably. Yeah, that's so, if it's possible to compare this in a way.
Generally, you are right. First of all, the Arab anti-Semitism is not, despite that the presence of Zionism then gave it a huge push, but it really predates. So there's a famous story. Moses Hess, intellectual who's kind of acclaimed by both the communism and Zionism, he's kind of a co-founder of communism and co-founder of Zionism. His conversion from communism to Zionism, to an idea of Jewish nationalism, happened actually in the 1840s. Do you know why? You know what accident provoked his...
The Damascus affair.
The Damascus affair. The Damascus affair was basically a blood libel that played in Damascus. So here you have an incident of this modern European anti-Semitism playing out way before. It actually provoked, ironically, it was actually what provoked, for example, the transformation of somebody as consequential as Moses Hess to an idea of Jewish nationalism. Then later on, you have actually found in early newspapers in Egypt, even before that text from Rashid Rida, that was the one that talked about anti-Semitism as a phenomenon. But if you go earlier, I found letter to the editors, maybe 10 years before this, asking editors of new modern Arabic newspapers, like the one Rida, asking, do Jews really eat blood on Passover? So they are asking the editors, we heard or we read. So that's modern. You see these kind of things already making an influence. So I just want to make the point that the influence would have been there. But of course, anti-Semitism gave it an actual immediate political need, political context, it changed everything. About the comparability, you're right. Ultimately, the pathologizing of Muslims that you see in Raphael Patai, or if Islam as a civilization, if you take that civilizational perspective that somewhat Bernard Lewis has, ultimately is the parallel to writings like Hassan Zaza. And ultimately, both of them rest in 19th century European scholarship. And I'm interested in the methodology primarily in my own free time. But there's a difference in scale, and there's a difference also in political consequences of this. That is, if you read, for example, Bernard Lewis, who I believe did pathologize Islam as a world civilization, his goal was not to destroy it. His goal was to say that it's different, and we have to deal with it as different, leave it alone, and make them leave us alone. That's kind of I think the overall purpose of scholarship like those of Lewis. That's not the case in the Arab scholarship. The Arab scholarship, first of all, we're talking about state-sponsored scholarship. That is somebody like Hassan Zaza. He's actually on the payroll of the Egyptian government. Cairo University is part of he was in Alexandria University. That's an Egyptian government-run university. These people are part of the government. We're talking about a power directly producing knowledge of the enemy, constructing an enemy in massive nationalist projects, specifically if you take the context of Nasserism, you take the context of the Cold War. That's very different than I think than the Jewish parallel to this. So I don't want to well, Bernard Lewis had relations with power, but later on, but a lot of even Raphael Patai. But I think a lot of the Jewish reaction in terms of these kind of scholarship, I think a lot of it was reactive. And I blame most of it, to be completely honest. Maybe I'm being too charitable here, and I'm open to be accused of being too charitable with one side. Maybe I am. I think it comes from the flawed methodology, completely flawed methodology. That is, for example, if you think about what I just talked about, basically I said that Arab culture, a lot of people living in this delusion that Muslims and Arabs are stuck in the 7th or the 9th century. I don't think that's true. Modern anti-Semitism, they have just been modern people. They have a modern culture. That's not what Bernard Lewis said. Bernard Lewis basically had this civilizational, historical perspective in which this is a self-generating Islam, and the logic of anti-Semitism or hating Jews is internal to it. I think that was a lot of it with actually more flawed method than anything else.
Questions? I think the first one to ever show up was actually Johannes and then Fabian. But please also, then the others can also show up.
Yeah, I just want to point out that we're officially supposed to end at some point. Right? So people arrived here at 9:30 in the morning. Maybe if we end in 10 to 15 minutes?
15? 50.
Because not everybody is a super specialist on this topic. And some
let's make it quick.
So I'm going to ask a very quick question. You talked a lot about enmity.
Yeah.
What about the ambivalence? Just give you one example, at least from my personal experience in the Arab world. The motif of Jews as a projection screen of a lost cosmopolitanism.
Of a lost cosmopolitanism.
Yeah. So Egyptian movies, the new Moroccan Museum of Moroccan Judaism. Jews are kind of a stand-in for kind of something that has been lost,
right, but that
could be recovered, not through the mass return of Jews, but kind of through massaging the constitution a bit, opening up the public space. So that would be one form of a positive projection on Jewish history in the Arab world.
It does exist. I said there is a benign revisionist of the nationalist historiography that's going on, but I think it has its limitation. I mean, because you have to do it with excluding any possibility of Arab guilt of anything. Or at least minimizing it, and most importantly, also make sure that the charge of anti-Semitism that Arabs are very sensitive about, because of the politics of it, doesn't stick. So you have to kind of keep dancing around and surgically make it that really it was unfortunate for Jews to leave. Just why and how, make sure that doesn't get too tricky. So there are attempts like that in very limited circles, primarily some intellectuals, kind of liberal left, and also that intersects with the positive. So yeah, that does exist, and that does, I think, among certain segments of the population, that does produce levels of ambivalent, which I think actually is pretty. By the end of the day, whether popular culture, whether high culture anti-Semitism, I mean, cultural anti-Semitism that doesn't have, or any movement that doesn't have, any abstraction that doesn't have an immediate object, ultimately remains an abstraction. And I think this is actually the case of a lot of other people in Arab societies. If maybe there are Jews here who have this experience, who travel to Egypt, who has toxic levels of anti-Semitism, but you travel to Egypt and you find the people pleasant, often, and you don't have problems, and then you don't know how to explain that. And that's exactly because that this is ultimately, by the end of the day, is a cultural construction that in moments of political tension might receive some energy, but it's there. It's a dead weight. I think of it as this huge dead torso that is kind of on top of modern Arab culture. Nobody knows how to remove it.
Fabian, actually, I've wrote a paper with exactly the same topic. Interesting, about Egyptian television series and books. I said they want to make memory culture, but they can't because of nationalism. Yeah, Fabian.
I'll get up because I can hardly see you when I'm seated. So thanks for a very stimulating talk. I learned a lot. That said, I wasn't quite convinced by your last rhetorical twist where you basically showed continuities in the iconography, and you basically showed a religious picture, then secularized ones, then a religious one. I didn't quite buy that it's the secularization where anti-Semitism has to be originated. But my question is actually
that's a bigger topic. Yeah,
it's actually related to something else.
Yeah.
At several points in the talk, you quoted concrete instances and tropes of anti-Semitism, and very many of those you could have shown me and said these are Russian newspapers from 1905.
Right.
By the way, also not exactly you're a secular post-Christian atheist there writing these things. So, for instance, the one about Jews are not real traders, they're parasites. The ones about Jewish religion equivalating to racism. They wouldn't say racism, of course. They'd say something like racial exclusion or whatever. Obviously, the one about Jews being both capitalists and communists, subversives, which is very classic rhetoric of the 1905 revolution in Russia. So my question here would be, could you talk a little more about the concrete reception of anti-Semitic writings from various parts of Europe, not just Nazi, but pre-Nazi ones?
There are, the Russians specifically, I mean, the Russians had a huge, specifically on the Orthodox Christian community in the Levant. Now, that's also very complex and very relevant because that's actually the community that's, I would say, the founding political community of the modern Middle East is actually Levant Orthodox Christians. That is, they basically founded modern Arab nationalism, or Arab nationalism. And they founded a lot of the leftist movements, also they had New Left, and also Palestinian nationalism, a lot of it actually on the shoulders of specifically Greek Orthodox intellectuals. And they were actually under the, under the protection of Russia, specifically from the late 19th century. They had a huge seminarium in Jerusalem that was run by the Orthodox Church, actually all over that area. And there were reports, the local Jews at the time complained many times that the Russian schools are perpetuating anti-Semitism amongst the local population. So you have, of course, the missionaries. I mean, the Damascus affair, I think, was directly a result of the missionaries. That's one you can see clearly. So, of course, by the end of the day, this is a very short presentation. There are many sources. Anti-Semitism, I focused specifically on high culture, secular anti-Semitism, because I think that's one, it's completely off the radar of most people. Everybody just wants to blame it on religion and just move on. So it's just kind of correction, but no, there are actually various sources. The whole secularization, I understand your point, that's a bigger, I do believe secularization had a very key, that's actually also, that's not just me, that's Rosenzweig, Alfred Rosenzweig, Jewish intellectual, actually believed the same. He said at least, we could convert before, now we're going to go. But I do believe that secularization and actually a certain form of atheistic philosophy of history is actually directly at the root of this, specifically from my reading for Arab culture and the emergence of Arab nationalism and Islamism. Now, just one last remark. I do think a lot of what passes for religion since the beginning of the 19th century is atheism. This is also not just me. This is also an established idea. Alfred Rosenzweig, great intellectual, the best Jewish intellectual in the early, much better than Martin Buber, in my opinion. He has this essay called Atheistic Theology, in which he discusses this point. So since Schleiermacher, pretty much, they're talking about this phenomena was Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. And that's a much bigger. That's a whole. My goal, after hopefully, I have this fantasy that I will use this opening to talk about actually what happened to Islam in the last 150 years. That we're seeing in front of us is this atheistic European, Middle Eastern hybrid ideology that has nothing to do with what religion is, or at least what used to be. That's, as I said, that's a different topic.
I hope we're not confusing Alfred Rosenberg with Franz Rosenzweig.
Franz Rosenzweig.
Yes,
I'm sorry. Okay, Franz
Rosenzweig. But more questions. We still have a bit of time. Come on. Yes, please.
Okay, and then I'll pick up this last question. You're perhaps also familiar with this, all the critiques in German philosophy of the modern project as a neo-Gnostic project by Jakob Taubes, Voegelin, Karl Löwith.
Yeah.
And it seems that what you're talking about is very similar to the critique of the modern project as a secularization of the religious thought and the immanentization of the kind of this development towards the end of the world, right? Basically the eschatological teleology of the religion. And is that what you are implying, that what is happening as well in the Muslim society, and this is what brings to the anti-Semitism, this necessity in the Gnostic logic to find the evil in the world against which you're fighting? And in this sense, would it imply then that if we define humanism narrowly as this form of building a unity of mankind which requires defeating some evil, whether it's dark capitalism above or some other kind of evil force, then would it imply that what you also mean is that anti-Semitism can be seen as a form of humanism?
I do believe that the most potent form of anti-Semitism that emerged, the intellectually potent form of anti-Semitism that emerged in 19th century Europe was actually a humanism. It was a form of humanism. You find it in the writings of Wilhelm Marr, the triumph of Judaism over Germany. You find it in the writings of Düring. What's his name?
Eugen Düring.
Eugene Düring. I think that's his name. Okay, you find it in the writings of Düring. You find it in the writings of a lot of as I said, if you actually find it in Hegel, you find it in Hegel. I think it was actually quite clear in his early theological writings. So I think it's true. So about the point of neo-Gnosticism, I do believe that that's a phase of it. So I do read a lot of these critiques. I think these critiques are becoming more common now. People are kind of digging up these things because of just the situation with critical theory and things of that sort. And I think that's important, but I think people are missing also the point. That was a phase of it. We're already past that point. I mean, it's important for us to understand that, but we already passed these. We're after Babel. We're centuries after Babel, but things got so bad that we forgot that there was a Babel and that collapsed, and we're actually these are the smoldering ruins. So that was a phase of it. That was also a long time ago. I mean, we're down the line from dealing with this. I'm not saying that I have a clear idea. What I do have, I just have a critique in the way that people have been talking about these things. I mean, I grew up as a Muslim in Egypt, and I grew up in these conditions. And then after I discovered how bad things are, I found all of these big answers, and none of them ultimately explained what I know, what I lived through. None of it, and you have this insistence that this is one thing or the other, and theory-guided research here and there, and for me, ultimately, this is kind of a self-discovery, trying to figure out, my own life, what happened really. But ultimately, this is a task that's for exercise in general and hasn't really started. But I think that's a good place to start. But as I said, it's just a phase. Even the critique of neo-Gnosticism itself was also a phase of this entire intellectual history. I mean, I think it was Augusto Del Nuce from Italy also made it in the 1950s and 1960s. Okay, they are now calling me. But I think, yes, it's a good place to start. Thank you very much. Thank you.